Hi, everyone. I'm Suzanne Clemens, one of the pastors at Trinity United Methodist Church in Lafayette, Indiana, and I'm really happy to be sharing the message this first Sunday in Advent. And our scripture at the beginning of Advent, well, it conveys an urgency to us around knowing what time it is, around us knowing the time that we find ourselves in. And I know that we all have our own ways of relating to time, don't we? So some of us are early birds, right? We're our most engaged and productive selves early in the morning. And then others of us are night owls, right? We're at our best after the sun goes down. Some of us are really driven to keeping an eye on the time and making sure that we're always 5 to 10 minutes early for every appointment on our calendars. And some of us are just more relaxed in our expectations. We're comfortable arriving a few minutes late. And then a few of us, well, we couldn't keep track of the time if our lives depended on it. And I know this to be true because I grew up with a mother who was constantly losing track of time. I mean, in my family, we were late for everything. I was constantly in trouble for being tardy to school because my mom would take me in the mornings. And she would run all the clocks in the house ahead, anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes, in an effort to kind of trick herself into being on time. But this never worked. Instead, what happened was no one in our house ever had any idea what time it actually was. And it was maddening. And many years ago, when my mom was out shopping one time, she came across a clock that was just perfect for her. And she purchased this clock, brought it home, and this timepiece, well, it still sits on her dresser in her bedroom, and it makes me laugh every time I see it. It is just perfect, right? It's for those of you listening, it is a clock with the word whatever across the top of the face of the clock. And then the numbers on the clock are just jumbled down toward the bottom. And every time I pass by this clock and at my parents' house, it makes me laugh. Well, my mother, well, she may not have been able to keep track of chronological time, but she had a steady faith and she trusted that God held all things together in His time, which can't be measured by the clock. We know that the ancient Greeks had two different understandings of time. The time that we count and that we keep track of on our calendars, our systematic human way of tracking time. And they also had a concept of a deep sense of time. This is the time when things are right, when things come into fulfillment, and they call this Kairos time. And as Christians today, we sometimes speak of God's time as Kairos time, which is a divine long view of time. So what does our scripture today say about where we are in that long view of time, and how are we invited to live within this time? Well, first, our scripture says that we're to know what time it is within the long view of God's time. And I'm sorry for all of you night owls who might be listening, but our scripture makes it clear that as Christians, we are morning people. For us, the day is breaking. The dim light of day is on the horizon. We can see it coming. And so as Christians, we live in really what is an in-between time, not total darkness of night, but yet not full light of day. And in this in-between time, which side then do we orient ourselves toward? What direction are we looking? What are we longing for? Well, we long for the light, don't we? We wait with eager anticipation for the full break of day that is coming. And it's not a fake or forced hope for us. Our hope is not just wishful thinking that this is going to come, because we know that the light has already come before. God has come in history. God looked upon our suffering and brokenness and chose to enter into it in the most unexpected way as a vulnerable baby born to a poor peasant virgin girl. God came to show us a different way of compassion and gentleness, a way of mercy and forgiveness and peace. And so today, we yearn and we wait for the full breaking in of God's presence among us, trusting that what has come before will come again. And during Advent, we allow ourselves to be woken up and guided by this yearning. But sometimes I think with all that is going wrong in our world and in our personal lives, we find ourselves yearning for peace and wholeness on one hand, and also at the same time pulled into darkness and helplessness. Like the psalmist, we are acutely aware of the suffering around us. We find ourselves heartbroken and terrified by the escalation of mass shootings and the extensive suffering that the violence around us causes. Climate change and its toll on both the environment and humanity, it alarms us. Much in our world seems designed to keep reminding us of how much trouble we're in. There is the endless news cycle, right, that keeps circulating. On the one hand, gun violence, disease, and epidemic levels of anxiety. And then on the other hand, we're fed stories of lavishness and unbridled consumerism and affluence. And both kinds of stories ultimately leave us impoverished, empty, even traumatized. And we're cautioned by Scripture not to live in the dark, which I would argue means that we're not to let narratives of despair become our meta-narrative, right? Or our anchor in reality. These stories are not the ones that tell us who we really are, and they don't point us in the direction of a hopeful future. Now, we do need to stay attuned to the voices of those who suffer and experience injustice, but the larger energy and spiritual grounding of stories matters. When they're part of an endless cycle of fear and despair that mostly serves to increase our collective anxiety, we should beware. What then has become of our hope? And the hope of Advent also isn't about just keeping our chin up or cultivating an optimistic attitude or even a glasses half full approach to life. Hope is not about being perky or even happy. The hope of Advent is a deep inner trust that God's light has and will ultimately break through the darkest circumstances, and that the Spirit will lead us in that light. It's an inner grounding that cannot be swayed by our circumstances or by the headlines. Pastor Kevin O'Brien tells a story of his ministry in a juvenile detention center in San Pedro in Southern California. And this was a dismal place where he was in ministry, where vulnerable children from very different backgrounds were placed together. And there were kids in this place who had run away from home. There were kids who were in trouble for misbehavior. There were undocumented children. And he tells the story of one of the children, Luke, a 16-year-old young man, one of the oldest boys who was there in this facility. Luke had been abused by one of his parents. He had run away from home and had been picked up on the street by law enforcement. And O'Brien tells that this young man could have intense periods of anger, but he also had a gentle and caring side to him. O'Brien also tells the story of a girl named Maria, who was 14. She had risked dangerous passage from El Salvador, where she had been born and raised. She came to the U.S. trying to be reunited with her mother, who was in the southwest part of the United States. And she had been caught with a group of migrants crossing the desert. And she exhibited a confidence and a spunk that was well beyond her years, although she confided in Pastor O'Brien that she often inwardly felt really scared. And O'Brien, as he ministered to these young people, he marveled at how well the group of children and teenagers in this depressing place, how well they got along given the language and cultural barriers that they had, given the diversity in their life experiences, and especially given the differing traumas that each one of them had survived and that followed them in this place. You see, these kids, they bonded over card games and basketball, and all they really had was each other. And on one of his last days on mission in this detention center, Pastor O'Brien writes that he met with Luke and Maria, kind of a farewell meeting with them, and he encouraged them to take care of themselves and to especially watch over the younger children who were there. And as he left near the dinner hour later that day, he looked back one time to see them coming together. Maria was holding a tearful child on her lap. Luke was calling out to kids who were missing, rounding them up to come in for dinner. And in his own wakeful and watchful state, what Pastor O'Brien saw was a holy family, a family sitting down together for their shared meal, compassion making a way among them where there seemed to be no way. As I look around and observe the way that God breaks through in our community at Trinity, I have a story of hope that inspired me this past week, and I hope that it will inspire you. As Trinity's visitation pastor, I spend a lot of time visiting our seniors and our folks who are homebound. And it can be discouraging for us when we get to a point where we can no longer live independently. When our physical bodies are diminished, when we become isolated from others, it's hard, and we grieve what we have lost. Tammy Poor is one of our Trinity members who's experienced significant hardship in the span of just a few years. She has a degenerative disease that took her mobility and independence from her in her late 30s. And she was forced just a few years ago to move into a care facility so that she could receive skilled nursing care. Tammy lives with chronic pain. She has 2 young adult children who both have some significant health concerns. They live with their dad. She sees them some, but not as much as she would like. And Tammy's mom passed away a few months ago after a long bout with cancer. And due to her immobility, Tammy was not able to see her mom toward the end of her life, nor was she able to attend her memorial service. Tammy is someone, when I visit with her, who is authentic about her own struggles. Our visits include tears, questions, ponderings, hugs, and prayers. And this past week, I opened my email to see a message from Tammy. She wrote me that she has been thinking, and she asked, is there a way that I can be part of the care ministry at Trinity? She said, I feel that I can be a point of contact right here where I am. She wrote, there's a way I think that I can help right here from my place at home at the healthcare center. Well, ever since I received that message this week, I've been thinking about it. Tammy's compassion, her hope, and her vision is an inspiration to me. And I am eager this next week to follow up with her and to visit with her, to listen to her dreams, to see how together that she and I and others here at Trinity can be part of God's long view, right? Living into the morning light, no matter the opportunities or the barriers of our present circumstances, no matter how grim the news feed continues to be. And Advent is the perfect time for us to be doing this. Advent reminds us that the future is in God's hands. In our brief chronological moment here on earth, we can move it forward by living in the light, by loving our neighbor as ourselves, by trusting that in God's time, all will be well. We live in the light by choosing forgiveness instead of holding a grudge, by asking for help when we need it, and by choosing hope over despair. People who hope live differently because they trust that a good God is working for the complete well-being of all of humanity. Do you believe it? Can you catch a glimpse of it, of God's goodness and grace moving in your life and in our world? May God wake you up this Advent to see His grace and movement in your life and in our world.